Recently, I think it was about 6 months ago, Neil Roberts, an emeritus professor of English at Sheffield University, published A Lucid Dreamer, a biography of Peter Redgrove. I read this book, I think, 3 times, and it is a very much a book written by an aficionado, an enthusiast for Peter Redgrove's work. And the picture it portrays of Redgrove is that he was a very, very important poet, though he did have some kind of psychiatric problems. I knew Redgrove very well in the 60s when he was Gregory Fellow at Leeds University for 3 years, and he was very, very grandiose. And writing a novel a few years ago called Pitfall Street, one section of it is about the 60s in Leeds and the Gregory Fellows in particular. And as Redgrove was alive, I rechristened him Palgrave. And this is how I actually saw him. 1961, the year of the Great Freedom. Poetry falling from the air, so fast there was hardly time to write it down and type it up 2 fingers and post it off to the Poetry Review with a letter of acceptance by return, and waiting to see the poem in print in the next issue, opposite one by Thomas Blackburn, about Beethoven crashing against the bars of being as he suffered his becoming. Friday night was poetry night, and I started by getting lost amongst Guiseley's hills and mills. Like a blind mole in mittens, I groped my way to the tiny town hall, hardly bigger than decent-sized public convenience when such things still existed. The main room was long and full of smoking men in steaming mackintoshes and boiling radiators to lean against. Figures were gesturing on the platform. The bald, fat one must be Frank Palgrove, the new Hunter Fellow at the university. He rose and swayed, then jerked into speech, a doll for his own ventriloquism, his mouth opening and closing like a goldfish in a bowl, until someone remembered to switch on the microphone and his voice suddenly boomed. A tree in a storm is like a brain in a brainstorm. It was like an electric current, a blue flame flashing from one porcelain pole to another, cascades of water, gushes and jets, rainbows and apples, cider vats with the odd dead rat, couples copulating on bomb sites, tornadoes where words whirled in a vortex like the storm over Kansas that sent the neighbours' chattels, chickens in coops, surreys with fringes on top, rocking cradles with babies, clear from their moorings, flying with Dorothy and Toto to the land of the Munchkins over the rainbow. Next morning I rushed into Allsticks to snatch Palgrove from the shelves, still white hot. Trembling like an anecdotal leaf, I fingered the lemon and pale green covers as though they were exotic fruit, sniffing the sheets where they were stitched to savour the exhilarating odours of print shop and bindery. I ran my eyes over the backs, where syrupy euphoric reviews lined up from the columns of magazines that never seemed to appear on bookstores, with titles like John o' London's and Time and Tide, the wallow of words attributed to John Layman or his sister Rosamond or some other relative. My next Palgrovian encounter was slightly more intimate, at a meeting of the Leeds Writers' Circle, hurriedly convened, but rather sparsely attended, in a room rented from the Art College over its Cookridge Street annex. A couple of dozen 50-somethings, mostly male, were scattered over rows of hard-backed chairs. Predictably pipe-smoking predominated, so I lit a gold-tipped black Balkan Sobrani, richly scented and wanton as an Angre nude. Palgrove hadn't appeared. The members were chit-chatting among themselves. There seemed some unease. I couldn't quite place when Palgrove finally strutted in, green corduroyed, black-sweated and yellow-booted, the campus bard sans pure. Discomfited, the chairman dithered and dathered, gathering bits of paper and asking the secretary, "Is this him?" Supposedly sotto voce, forgetting he had already switched on the microphone, and that he was broadcasting not only his ignorance, but nuances of suppressed hostility. "If you mean, am I Frank Palgrove, the new Gregory Fellow, then the answer is most certainly in the affirmative. I am he, and you, I suppose, are the Leeds Writers' Circle. Apparently your chairperson, who was years ahead of his time in the careful neutering of gender, has never heard of me. I am a well-known poet, a very well-known poet. My poems are published by Routledge, and I'm in the New Poetry. I find such ignorance colossal and bewildering. You call yourself men of letters, yet you appear to have no knowledge of contemporary literature. I'm here amongst you, and it may not be for very long. His eyes were glazed and his tone somewhat messianic. I waited with interest the response to his soliloquy. There was some shuffling and stirring, and an increase in puffing, and a marked preoccupation with refilling and damping down and pouch fumbling. As chairman, I'd like to apologise to Mr. Palgrave on all our behalves. Grove! Palgrove, the bard countered with some hauteur. He rasped his scuffed boots on the boards, and his eyes glowed incessantly. One of the audience rose. Well, I, for one, can't say I've ever heard of you. Not that I'm all that struck on modern poetry anyway. A bit too abstract and usually totally incomprehensible. A knitting lady nodded and clacked her needles like an attendant tricoteuse, her eyes gleaming. I'm an artist, not a provider of fodder, Palgrove retorted. Nettled, the thriller writer stamped out, slamming the door. Well, I interjected, Mr. Palgrove does have some claim to fame. The critic John Layman, writing in John of London, says Palgrove's poetry is strong and vital and full of raw energy, being released into our ordinary lives, upsetting our staid equilibria and re-establishing natural harmonies. Of course, you are free to agree or disagree with Mr. Layman. Palgrove seemed to have established his own internal equilibrium. He sat and stroked his bald head and patted a yellow boot. I'm very sorry, he said, but I do have a pressing engagement. I hope you will all follow this young man's lead and buy my books. I look forward to meeting you at some time in the future. He rose in his bardic finery and swept out. As soon as he had gone, there were exclamations of horror and outraged dignity. Is that a modern poet? He's an absolute disgrace. If he's joining, I'm resigning. I slipped out and wandered down Cookery Street and turned into Great George Street, and there was the Victoria behind the town hall. It had a long mirrored bar with secluded nooks upholstered in brass-studded maroon leather. I bought a lager and lime and looked round to see if there was anyone I knew, and spotted Palgrove sitting in an alcove nursing a whisky. When he saw me, he beckoned me over, bursting with bonhomie. Do come and sit down. What an awful bore and a bother that place was, with those twee old men. Truth to tell, I'm at a bit of a loose end this weekend. My friend Jack Horner, the poet, he rammed the words together like the carriages of a train, was supposed to be coming for a visit from London and bring me up to date on things. If you're away from the smoke for long, people start to forget about you. That's the drawback with fellowships like these. It's very useful for getting the mortgage paid and shutting up your wife and your bank manager, but when it comes to securing your reputation, it's a very different story. Anyway, to get back to what I was saying, do you know Jack's work? Oh yes, very well. He's a satirist who writes about nuclear testing and acid rain. That's a chap. Really good stuff, quite vigorous, almost Elizabethan at times. He's in advertising, like most of my friends. I was in it myself until this Hunter Fellowship turned up out of the blue. Did you take your degree at Cambridge? Well, I was at Cambridge, but I never actually took my degree. I know it says I did in the English department prospectus, but it's a mistake, and I have pointed out to them. I was originally reading science. When I started to write poetry, it seemed silly not to go to the English lectures. I managed to get through my first year exams on the work I'd done for my A-levels, but I knew it would be a complete waste of time even attempting finals, so I never bothered going in. I managed to get a job in medical journalism, you know, doing write-ups for so-called new wonder drugs, stuff for GPs' journals. From that I eventually went into advertising. Did you work with any other poets? Oh yes, I was with Lucy Smith for a while. We used to spend all our time writing poetry. One day we had a 5 o'clock deadline, and we'd forgotten all about it until the copy boy stuck his head round the door to say we'd 5 minutes to come up with a slogan for the next month's national advertising campaign. So Edward suddenly says, "Percy will wash his whiter," and that was it. It turned out the most successful slogan in the history of advertising. Palgrove regaled me with other stories of his Cambridge and London friends. Then he went through some of my poems, and he carefully explained that poetry began where my poems ended. And if I listened to him and took his advice, I could be as successful as he was. Well, almost as successful. I listened to his wise words and thanked him dutifully. Then I went out into the night air of Leeds, headier than wine. I caught the bus back to Eden and read Palgrove's verses on the journey. Indeed, they were clever, and some of the words spat like coal in the fireback, but the effect of the whole was of nothingness and narcissism hiding behind a mask of swaggering braggadocio. I walked round the tarn, deserted in the moonlight, and sat and watched the water ripple and listened to the rigging of the yachts jigging in the wind, and in the distance a dog barked mournfully. I knew that everything I'd written and everything I'd ever write would be a sigh and a cry for Margaret gone.